Hello, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to Masechet Horayot. Masechet Horayot deals with erroneous decisions made by the Beit Din, by the Grand Court, sometimes identified as the Sanhedrin, or by other leaders of the congregation, such as the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, who's called in this Masechet the Kohen HaMashiach, and the Nasi, the political leader, also sometimes identified in this tractate as the king. So the Masechet recognizes that even very smart, very powerful, very successful people and leaders will make mistakes. And the question is, how can they atone for those mistakes? So the tractate is going to focus on these erroneous decisions and on the various korbanot, the various sacrifices that different people need to bring in order to atone for the mistakes that they made. Now, the Torah discusses the issue of errors in two different places. The first is in Leviticus 4, and the second is in chapter 15 of Numbers. And the rabbis understand these two different sections of the Torah, which talk about errors, as referring to two different issues. The first in Leviticus 4 that we're going to focus on is a discussion of an error that has occurred, a erroneous transgression regarding most of the commandments of the Torah. As the verse says, when a person unwittingly incurs guilt in regard to any of Hashem's commandments about things not to be done and does one of them. So any of God's commandments. And in contrast, the rabbis understand Numbers 15 as discussing specifically guilt in transgressions regarding to Avodah Zarah, to idolatry. Now, if you read this chapter in depth if you pause me and go through the chapter, you'll notice that the chapter talks about a regular person who incurs guilt. It talks about a priest who incurs guilt. It talks about the community who has erred in verse 13. Interestingly, in this translation, it's translated as if it is the community leadership of Israel. But in the Hebrew, it doesn't say leadership. It just says ha'edah. And later on in verse 22, the Torah talks about the Nasi, here translated as chieftain, who incurs guilt. So we have these different categories of transgressions and what needs to be done in each of these cases. And that's basically the structure of our Masechet of Horayot. Horayot literally means statements, so like Hora'ah, right? The same root as Torah, but really the Masechet is focusing on what happens if these pronouncements have been made erroneously. How do we fix them? And I mentioned the verse here, verse 13, that discusses the community leadership of Israel. I'll just switch for a second to the Hebrew. The Hebrew says, ואם כל עדת ישראל ישגו ונעלם דבר מעיני הקהל, ועשו אחת מכל מצוות השם אשר לא תעשנה, והשמו. So the verses should really be translated as, if all of the congregation of Israel erred and a matter escaped the notice of the congregation. But the rabbis are asking themselves the question, logical question, how could it be that the whole congregation will err at something, right? How can it be that hundreds of thousands of people will all make the same mistake at the same time? It has to be that the reason that they're doing it is that their leadership told them to do something that in retrospect turned out to be mistaken. So from this verse, the rabbis take the idea of the Beit Hadin, that the court made a certain pronouncement about what is the halacha in a certain case. And everyone, all the congregation went out and did what they were told to do by the court. And then in retrospect, it could be a generation later, could be a month later, the court revisited this halacha and determined that actually the previous pronouncement was mistaken. But so many people have gone and done an avera, a transgression now. So what are we supposed to do about that, right? So whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of each and every individual who did something mistaken? Or is it the responsibility of the court? And the individual people don't need to bring a sacrifice now to atone for their transgression because it wasn't really their transgression. It was the transgression of the Bet Hadin, the mistake of the Bet Hadin. So the first part of the tractate focuses on that question. And I'm going to switch for a moment here to a source sheet. So the first half of the Masechet, which is focusing on this idea that we have great faith in the court, but the court can make a mistake, raises a very strong tension, which reverberates until today in modern democratic societies, right? How do we treat the pronouncements of the court? And in a different place in the Torah, in Parashat Shoftim, the Torah talks about what to do when there's something that's unknown in the Torah, something that's unknown in the halacha. And it says if a case is too baffling for you to decide, then you have to go to the place that Hashem has chosen, which the rabbis understand to mean a court outside Bet HaMikdash. And you go to the court there, which is comprised of Levites and priests and a magistrate, a shofet, and you present the problem. And they'll determine what the verdict is, right? The reason they sit next to the Mikdash is because there's an idea that God's presence is there and will guide them. So once they have given out the verdict, then you have to carry out the verdict. You have to let all the people in all the cities know what the verdict is on this question of law. And importantly, in the last verse, the verse says, Al pi Torah asher yorucha ve'al hamishpat asher yomru lecha ta'aseh, lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'smol. You have to act in accordance with the instructions given to you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the left or to the right. So this sounds like, a very serious institutional authority, right? There's a court that represents God's word, and what they say goes. You can't have everyone doing whatever they want to do. And therefore, if the court issues a verdict, then all the people of Israel have to follow that verdict. And the Midrash on these verses in the Sifrei emphasizes this point and makes it even stronger and says, when the verse says, Al mishpat asher yomru lecha ta'aseh, this refers to positive commandments, mitzvot aseh. And when the verse says, Lo tasur min haTorah asher yagidu lecha, this refers to mitzvat lo ta'aseh, to a negative commandment. Don't think that there's a difference between positive commandment, negative commandment. Whatever they say, you have to listen to them in every realm of the Torah. And then the Midrash goes on to say something very forceful. When the verse says yamin usmol, when the verse says that you have to listen to them and not deviate either to the left or to the right, אפילו מראים בעיניך על ימין שהוא שמאל ועל שמאל שהוא ימין, שמע להם. Even if it seems in your eyes that they're telling you that left is right and right is left, listen to them. So even if you are looking at the verdict of the court and it seems to you completely the opposite of what is written in the Torah, or it doesn't adhere to certain principles or other sources that you know of, it doesn't matter. You have to follow the court's verdict. Why? We all understand why. We can't have everyone doing whatever they want. The legal system will go to pieces. Society will go to pieces. Sometimes we have to do things even if we think they are completely, completely wrong in order to preserve the authority of our institutions and in order to preserve law and order in our society. But what's very, very interesting against this background is that Mishnah Horayot raises questions about this strong idea of institutional authority. Because the very first Mishnah of the Masechet is not only acknowledging that the court can actually make mistakes, right, which is already uh, um, a kind of recognition that, okay, maybe for institutional, societal, systematic purposes, we have to follow the court. But we still recognize that they make mistakes. It's not that we're saying that because this court is representing the people of Israel and representing divine word, then they can never make a mistake, right? It's not like the idea, the doctrine that the Pope can never make a mistake. No, this court can make a mistake. But not only that, the Mishnah, the very first Mishnah of the Masechet, fascinatingly, goes even further and discusses the role of the individual vis-a-vis the court. How am I, as an individual, supposed to behave when I am absolutely certain that the court is wrong? And the Mishnah is talking here about a case where the Beit Din, the court, issued an incorrect ruling, right? They issued a ruling that in retrospect was recognized as a transgression of the Torah. And the assumption is that at a later point in time, the court will take back that verdict. But what happened to everyone who followed the verdict in the interim until it was recognized as a mistaken verdict? And the Mishnah distinguishes between two cases. First, it talks about a yachid, just a regular person. And it says that this regular person who is following what the court told him to do, which in retrospect was recognized as a transgression, this individual doesn't have to be a sacrifice when it's recognized that he had behaved in a way that was transgressive of the Torah. Why? Because the responsibility doesn't lie on each and every individual. It lies on the Beit Din. The Beit Din will have to bring a sacrifice, but the individual won't have to bring a sacrifice. By contrast, the second case that the Mishnah talks about, הורו בית דין וידע אחד מהם שטעו, או תלמיד והוא ראוי להוראה. So either someone who was part of the court, someone who sat on the court, or a talmid והוא ראוי להוראה, someone who is a student, a disciple, who is capable of making a ruling. If someone like this, who's knowledgeable, knows that the verdict of the Beit Din, of the court, is erroneous, then this person, if he didn't stand up to the court, didn't deviate from the verdict of the court, but rather went along with what the court said to do, he's going to have to bring a sacrifice to atone for his sin. He can't just say, well, it wasn't my fault, it was the court's fault, I just followed what they did. No. There's no expectation of this kind of blind obedience. And not only that, it's not only that it's legitimate for this individual to say, I'm not doing what the court told me to do, but you're actually obligated not to do what the court told you to do, right? Because if you don't do that, you're going to have to bring a sacrifice. And let's not forget, a sacrifice is an expensive fine to have to bring. So the Mishnah is really demanding here from the knowledgeable individual to use what's the word? Not jurisdiction, but to use good judgment and to stand up to the court. And so if we look together at these different sources, what we can see is that there's actually a system that is simultaneously looking at things from the institutional, systemic perspective of the court and saying, okay, the court has to behave in this way and it has to demand that everyone listen to its authority and not deviate to the left or to the right. But on the other hand, there's also another perspective. There's the perspective of the individual person, and this individual learned person has, I would say, rabbinic autonomy to stand up to the Beit Din and not to follow something that they know is clearly not the law, that it's clearly a transgression of the halakha. So there's a tension here between the sifrei that we saw that is demanding absolute and complete obedience, and between the Mishnah and Horayot. And the commentators discuss this a lot, and they offer different resolutions. One resolution could be that the sifrei is talking about just every man, while the Mishnah is focusing on the learned individual. And other ideas are also proposed. Maybe there's also just different schools of thought about this question, and the Mishnah is actually preserving a dispute about the foundations of the legal system. How do we treat the legal system, and what is the degree of obedience that we demand in order to, on the one hand, have a stable system, and on the other hand, not create people who are just blindly obeying the system without thinking and without using their own knowledge. Now, interestingly, at Masechet Horayot itself in the Talmud, I would say emphasizes, takes even more strongly the point of the Mishnah. So it's really staking out the claim that individuals need to exercise their autonomy, need to exercise their own thinking, their own knowledge. And we see that both in the beginning of the Yerushalmi and the beginning of the Bavli to the Tractate. The Yerushalmi says, it talks about that same verse that we saw from Dvarim, and it says, could it be that if they tell you about right that it is left, and about left that it is right, that you should listen to them? Which is exactly what the Sifrei said. Yes, you absolutely have to listen to them. But here the Yerushalmi says no. The verse says to the right or to the left. When they tell you about the right, that it is right, and when they tell you about the left, that is the left, that's when you listen to them. But if they tell you about left, that it's right, and about right, that it's left, then you don't listen to them. Okay, so the Yerushalmi is making the point that there's no blind obedience. You only have an obligation to listen to the court when the court is making a pronouncement that makes sense to you, that adheres to other sources that you know, and also maybe that seems morally correct. So on the one hand, we can admire this idea of every individual's autonomy, right? And it doesn't seem to be distinguishing here specifically Talmidei Chachamim necessarily. But on the other hand, we can also recognize the danger of this idea. It's a really an idea that is subversive, that can even bring to a certain degree of anarchy. So the sugiyot themselves will discuss these issues, and later commentators in the Middle Ages will try and systematize the different sources in order to make them cohere with one another. I just want to point out that the Bavli makes it really explicit that whereas the Mishnah said that an individual who listened to the Beit Din is exempt from bringing a korban, a sacrifice, because they just listen to the court and they don't have responsibility. Who has responsibility? Only someone who is knowledgeable, right? Only a talmid hara'ui lehora'ah. But the Bavli says, that's true that that's what that says in the Mishnah, but zo divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's only the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. But actually, the rabbis say that any individual who performs a transgression on the basis of the ruling of the court is liable. So the Bavli is taking this subversive idea of the individual's autonomy and saying it's not only about Talmidei Chachamim, every single individual who does something against their rabbinic conscience, against their knowledge of Torah, against their moral sentiment, and just follows the court blindly, is going to be liable. Okay? So again, this is a very radical idea that the rabbis are using to counterbalance the strong idea of the court's authority. And on the other hand, we can also understand that it can create problems if everyone applies this idea however they want, and therefore we need some checks and balances on this idea, which we'll also see throughout the Masechet. So the first part of the Masechet is going to discuss at length this idea of the court and the individual versus the court, and also discuss the specifics of the sacrifices that need to be brought in each of these cases when the court errs, when the individual follows, which individual follows, etc. As we mentioned at the beginning, the chapters in the Torah which discuss the errors of different parties, different institutional parties, also singled out the high priest and the Nasi, the king. And the second and third chapters of our Masechet will focus on these individuals, recognizing that because of their leadership and because of their high rank, then they have special obligations. And when they err, when they transgress, when they make a mistake, then the sacrifices that they'll have to bring will also be different from the rest of the people. I want to point out that when we looked at the verses in the Torah, we saw that the Torah, when it's talking about an individual or a Kohen or Kol Ha'edah or the whole congregation, it says, if the individual will sin, or if the congregation will sin, or if the Kohen will sin. But when it talks about the Nasi, the political leader, it says when the Nasi will sin. So already the Torah is recognizing that when it comes to political leadership and all the many minute and huge decisions that need to be made, it's impossible not to err. There's always going to be mistakes, and those mistakes have far-reaching impact on many, many, many people. But the Torah itself is already recognizing that leadership involves mistakes. Don't think that because you're a leader, you're above mistakes, but rather recognize that leadership is always going to involve many actions, and doing so many actions is going to involve making mistakes. And the question is not, did you make a mistake, but rather, how do you atone for that mistake? So when we look at this Masechet as a whole, we can see it as kind of a complement maybe to the first two chapters of Sanhedrin, which discussed the different responsibilities of the court and the Kohen and the king. And here, Masechet Horayot is talking about what happens when there's a problem, when there's a mistake, when there's a transgression. How do each of these authorities respond to mistakes and to transgressions that have led others astray? And not only that, but it's also not only thinking about the institutional perspective, but also asking the question of how do I, as an individual, not as a leader, but as a follower, respond to these kinds of mistakes made by the leaders of the congregations. So we'll see that many of the details of the Masechet focus on sacrifices and issues that are not related to these big questions, but we have to remember that behind this minutiae are constantly these big questions about how to build a society. And in that sense, Masechet Horayot is a very fitting end to Seder Nezikin as a whole, which began with the damages between one individual and another, and concludes with the question of the damages or the problems that can be created on a much larger scale by the leaders of the community, and how those leaders can correct those mistakes and atone for the damage that has been done. Good luck with the Masechet.